بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى وارحمنا واغفر لنا لقد ظلمنا أنفسنا سبحانك لا إله إلا أنت. Amma ba'd. I wanted to talk about the Salafi Effect. And this goes beyond in focusing or encapsulating ourselves to the movement of Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab or the Saudi effort. The reality of the situation is that within the last 100 years, there was a lot of discussion among the scholars crossing geographical lines, whether it was on the continent of Africa or whether it was in the Indian subcontinent or whether it was in North Africa or whether it was in the region of Egypt, or whether it was in Sham, a number of different places, just to mention a few in passing. There's nowhere that we look that we can't take without giving some serious attention to the discussions that the scholars were having about one question. Why was it that the Muslims were confronting a decline? That was the major preoccupation of a good many scholars. And what we are shielded from, due to the distance that we have between ourselves in that time period, what we were shielded from is understanding the reality of the colonial situation. Most of us are not really aware of the depth of impact and the breadth of impact, how deep the colonial effort went and how widespread it was. Most of us have no clue or no idea with regard to the amount of killing of the scholars that took place. There was a serious effort at eliminating Muslim scholars from a post of authority in the Ummah overall. That was a serious reality that we saw, whether it was in Turkey, whether it was in Algeria, wherever we looked, we began to see the elimination of scholarship, and that came at different levels. At times, it was just straight out murder. At times, it was imprisonment. At times, it was exile. And then it came to the point wherein the scholars were humiliated by the class of people, a group of Muslims that were educated in Western institutions. The colonial powers were very strategic in creating a divide between the Muslims and Islamic scholarship. In Egypt, they humiliated the scholars, and poverty is what overtook many of the scholars. Now, part of the reason is because the colonial powers, overtook the endowment systems of the Muslim world. And the endowment systems of the Muslim world were institutions that were established to generate wealth to support various activities. Of those activities were educational activities. Endowments were established for a number of different reasons. Muslims had a strong legacy of endowments. As a matter of fact, if you go deep into the study of fiqh, there's a whole chapter that just deals with the reality of al-awqaf. Al-awqaf is the plural of waqf. And waqf is what we call the endowment. The endowment system allowed the scholars to be independent. As a matter of fact, the idea of the endowment is what allowed in contemporary times the Shia scholarship to remain independent. And to have a certain type of authority and standing in their community. Even the idea of giving money to the ulama, for a while, it was something that was allowing scholarship in Saudi to continue on. And here we're not, the idea is not, we're not talking about criticizing and all of this. We're describing a certain type of reality. In Damascus, for a long time, as well as in Egypt, there were all kinds of endowments. All over the Muslim world, this existed. And the endowments, once they were plundered and they were robbed by, especially, we began to see this in the later phase. We saw this in places like Egypt and other places by the Arab communists. I don't want to necessarily say Marxists, but the Arab communists. They had a certain idea and a certain concept, and they took the wealth of the endowment system, as well as others. Not only them, but there were phases in how it is that the endowment system was plundered. All that is important as a preliminary reflection to understand just the Salafi effect. It is one among many. But the Salafi effect is not what we think in our minds in the West. It was a call to return back to the Quran and the Sunnah. And it was a call that was engaged in by both what we would call Sufi and Athari. Those that were focusing on renewing hadith-based Aqida, and those that were from the tradition. We saw it across the board. This was a reality that is historical, is documented, it can't be denied. One of the problems that we have with some of the clashing that we're seeing in throughout this decade or so or more is that some of it is based on very personalized reasons. My sheikh, my group, that type of thing, and that's why you begin to see these clashes. One of the things we can say about the scholars of Deoband, the Indian subcontinent scholars, whether they're in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, is that there was a tendency to be more harmonious on this point of Aqidah issues. Whether it was Maturidi or following Ibn Taymiyyah, there was a little more harmony, right? And when it came to the Salafi Dawah and Sufism, when we look at Yemen, like we look at the school of one of my teachers called them a Shawkaniyun, but that's not the proper term, actually. He called them the Shawkanis. But that's not the proper term, because Shawkani wasn't alone in that. Imam al-Shawkani, Muhammad bin Ali al-Shawkani. There were a number of scholars, Sheikh al-Maqbali, not Sheikh Muqbil, Sheikh al-Maqbali, Sheikh Amir al-Sana'ani, Imam al-Wazir. There was a group of them that they were originally actually grounded in the Zaydi madhab, but they were very close to the Sunnis and that they were studying hadith and so on and so forth, and they were correcting even their own school. And in that school, which also impacted people like Sadiq Hassan Khan, who eventually became the founder, or one of the heads, I should say, one of the main elders of the Ahl Hadith movement in the subcontinent. You find that the way that they dealt with issues of Sufism was much less aggressive than what you began to see in the Hijaz, in specific within Saudi. And there's historical reasons for all of this stuff. There's historical reasons, contrary to what many of us would like to believe or think, or just kind of ignore it. There's very real reasons why these movements emerged. More than just saying that also these movements were encouraged by the colonial efforts and so on and so forth. That's a whole different discussion. On the ground itself, there was decline in the Muslim community across the board. So part of the idea of the Salafi effect was that people were questioning, how is it that we declined and we got to this point? And so they moved into a phase of saying, we need to revive. We need to revive. And part of the idea of reviving the deen, or tajdeed of the deen, went back to the issue of going back to the Quran and the Sunnah. And so that's why you can find like Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio, and the one who did this research is actually Dr. Abdul Hakim Quick, or Abdul Hakim Quick. He did the research, and he has a video. There's a video somewhere around. It's been out for almost 15 years or so. And anyone can access him. They can send him a message. He seems to be pretty accessible, and talk to him about this. That's why in the same isnad, or the same transmission system, you find Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, you find Hayat al-Sindi, and you find Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi. There was this tendency of questioning, even though people had different trajectories of thought. All those scholars, they have different tendencies. You understand what I'm saying? Even though they may be a little similar, they have different tendencies. But people were questioning, why is it that the Muslims went into decline? We have to return back to the Quran and the Sunnah. So there was this push to go back to the Quran and the Sunnah. And some of it was done better, and some of it was done bad, in terms of the approach that was being taken. Now, you have the Ghumari brothers. The Ghumari brothers eventually gave birth to a Tulaydi, and the Ghumari brothers are a late phenomenon, more recent to our time. Some of our teachers, they took from the Ghumari brothers. I actually had isnad from the Ghumari brothers, specifically Abdullah, and some of our teachers studied with them. In particular, Sheikh Ali Juma has studied with Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdul Aziz was another one that was pretty famous. They themselves were varied in their approach, in their Aqidah, to the point where some of the scholars began to accuse some of them of being confused, but they were calling to the book and the Sunnah. They were calling to the book and the Sunnah. So eventually their student, Tulaydi, he wrote a book. It was very similar to Fiqh al-Sunnah, which I have in my possession. It's a very nice book, actually. You understand what I'm saying? A very nice book. So the Salafi effect eventually gave birth to people like Al-Albani. Al-Albani, Muhammad Nasir al-Din Al-Albani, was reading Rashid Rida. And Rashid Rida was the antidote to the excesses of Sheikh Muhammad Abdu. And Sheikh Muhammad Abdu, and the excesses that he's always accused of and all this type of stuff, he was attempting to stave off the British and the French intellectual attack on the Muslims. So he began to lean towards the Mu'tazila, which were basically a school that was extremely rationalist, and he tried to address issues that were coming up in science, the doubts that were being brought up in science. But they themselves, although they had a different trajectory, they had the idea of, let's go back to the Quran and the Sunnah. So in the Salafi effect, let's leave aside the madness of the masajid and what a lot of us have experienced. The 100-year Salafi effect that came from both Sufis and Asharis, and it came from Atharis, or those who were focusing on hadith-based Aqida, whether it was the tendency of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab or Shawkani or Sadiq Hassan al-Khan or others. You even see the Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodi's writings. Everyone was pushing to this idea, we have to get back to the revelation. We have to get back to understanding the sources of Islam so that we can get guidance to be able to deal with our situation. So after 100 years analysis, if you look at the Albani effect by itself, leave aside the negatives. The Albani effect forced the university systems to focus on, when a student does research in Quran and Sunnah, when a student does research, when a student does research in tradition, to reference Quran and Sunnah, to make sure that the hadith that they're using is verified, that we know the level of strength to it. That's part of the Albani effect. But Albani by himself doesn't have all the credit in that. You understand what I'm saying? There's a whole movement behind that as to why that got to that point. That the Muslims began to be much more conscious in terms of what they were using. Sayyid Sabiq was asked by Hassan al-Banna to write a book that would simplify fiqh. People can critique fiqh sunnah all they want, but fiqh sunnah, what it did was it simplified the language for people away from the technicality and at times the unclear language that we find in tradition. And by the way, even Shaykh Uthman Dan Fodi rahmatullahi alayhi acknowledges this problem in his books. He talks about it in Umdat al-Muta'abbidin, and he talks about that in other books as well, about the lack of clarity at times and taking a lifetime to understand a book or understand knowledge, and the necessity of shortening the path, the necessity of focusing on the Quran and Sunnah. And he by no means is an Albaniite, or he's by no means is, a disciple of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. It's a problem that was acknowledged by a good many scholars, that the language of the ulama became so dense and obtruse and unclear that it took so much for the people to be able to study. That doesn't mean that we throw out the tradition. It doesn't mean that we castigate the scholars, that we lambaste them, that we talk negative. There was a reason why the scholars began to write in the way that they wrote, in very locked language. They were engaged in another process of revival. And that only becomes clear when we look at the history of revival overall and what the scholars were attempting to do, and when we respect the tradition. But in the Salafi effect, what it did was it forced everyone to make sure that they were understanding the foundations of the text. Now, recently I was listening to the introduction to Sharh al-Kabir. Sharh al-Kabir is the major explanation, or the greater explanation, or the bigger explanation. Some words flow better than others for translating Sharh al-Kabir. That's why I'm using multiple words. Of Mukhtasar al-Khalil. And Mukhtasar al-Khalil is the primer of Khalil, Imam Khalil. And he became known as the Imam of Fatwa in the Maliki Madhab, because in his book he summarized a lot of the major books of Fatwa in the Madhab, the Maliki Madhab, and he condensed it into one book and locked the language and made it like kind of where instead of reading 100 books or 50 books, you can go to Khalil but you have to spend time in unlocking the language, because it was a feat that he was engaged in. To how do you summarize all of these books, and how do you do it in a way where you can do it in one text? You can summarize thousands of pages in about 200 pages. You know, you have to have the skill of expressing yourself in a language that can capture tons of meaning and be open to multiple trajectories of meaning, but it has to be unlocked. So in that explanation of that book of Khalil, Sheikh Sadiq al-Ghiriyani, who's the Mufti of Libya, and he's actually also a scholar in the Maliki Madhab, and he's produced in the Maliki Madhab, he talked about the problem of what had happened with the Malikis. That there was a lot of issues that took place in education, and I talked about this in another talk about Maliki scholarship. But when Al-Andalus collapsed, a lot of books were lost. Like, we take that stuff lightly. And now, remember that the fall of Al-Andalus is followed by the fall of Timbuktu. Timbuktu's manuscripts, we didn't know about them until recently, because all that stuff was taken underground. The Malikis received the heavy blow. And remember that at the same time that Al-Andalus collapses, Timbuktu is in decline, Morocco is engaged in warfare. They were part of the cause of the fall of Timbuktu, but they themselves were being hit by the French. Napoleon is going into Egypt. The colonial powers are stealing manuscripts. That's why you can find manuscripts in the West, in Leiden, in Princeton University, in universities in England and so on, that you can't find it in the Muslim world, because they stole all of that stuff. Mahmoud Shakir, in a text called Risalatu ila Thaqafatina, the treatise that opens the way to our culture, he explains this phenomena and the decline of the Arabic language, and a lot what took place and how the Muslims were assaulted and colonized. And part of what he said is that the colonial power stole a lot of manuscripts. So the Malikis, as an example, and you have to keep with my way of thinking is interconnecting realities. And sometimes there's a fine connection. And to understand the point is, I'm making a series of connections to talk about the Salafi effect in the last 100 years. And one of the benefits that we see. But before going to that, I wanted to talk about the necessity of having revivalist movements. And it's erroneous to equate the Salafi dawah only with Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. That's an error, and that's a monopolization that took place due to petrodollars, due to the Saudi dollars. And that was not the reality in the 80s, in the early 90s. That became the reality in the post 90s, early 2000s, that the Salafi dawah became completely collapsed with the movement of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab for various reasons. In any event, the traditional path, if we use the Maliki school as an example, went into decline. It went into decline in general, not in specific. In specific, we had scholars that were reviving. In specific, we had tendencies all over the world that were reviving. But when we look in general, the madrasa systems and the educational systems pretty much collapsed in the face of colonialism. And a lot of us don't even know that the madrasa system that we find in the Indian subcontinent, it was organized by the colonial powers at the end. The colonial powers, the British system, organized the madrasa system. And that's the same system that was utilized in the Afghan war for the purposes of initiating a war and doing what was done, in terms of combating the Russians. That's a discussion in and of itself. But our educational systems were collapsed. So the traditional system was sleeping for a while. I remember even myself, when I was studying in Egypt, I would look at the Salafi scholars. And here I'm using Salafi scholars in a very limited way, not in a broad sense. And they had more mastery over technology. They were more focused on finishing books. They were more committed to teaching. And sometimes we would sit with scholars in Al-Azhar and we wouldn't finish a book. Although there's some benefit, it's not a total criticism. There was not a lot of attention. I remember in Mudiafa al-Adawi, right? Mudiafa al-Adawi. In Mudiafa al-Adawi, Sheikh al-Adawi's guest house, I asked the head, who was the family member, I said, can we record? Because we were starting to record as students. I said, can we record these classes in a systematic way? And I remember that he kind of shrugged me off. Then I look later, now they have a whole system of recording and they have systematized the same thing in Al-Azhar. I was one of those students that was pushing for what later became Al-Azhar TV. We were calling for that. We were part of that generation that was not scared to go into the masjid and study in the masjid. We were part of the shade of the movement of Ali Juma with all his problems that he had in fatwa. But Ali Juma contributed greatly to the revival of Al-Azhar in the masjid. We were studying with Sheikh Uthman bin Uthman, with Sheikh Tahir Rayyan, with Ali Juma, and a number of others. There were few scholars that were teaching in the masjid. But I was part of that brigade, so to speak, of students that was committed to the masjid before it became what it is now, or what it was recently, we should say. And it became a full madrasa, just like of old. And Sheikh Ali Juma had a lot to do with that. And at that time, Sheikh Ali Juma had Sufis and Salafis coming to his class. Salafi in the narrow sense. But the Salafis in the narrow sense were pushing the traditional camp. And it was not until recently when Saudiya fell. How did it fall? It fell because Salman initiated his vision. And it released, and he began to arrest the Salafi scholars. And there were dollars being pushed, and they're still being pushed right now, to push Ibn Arabi, to push an extreme Sufism. But what happened was that in recent times, now we're going to come to the Salafi effect. This narrow Salafi dawah that was birthed out of the general call to come back to the Quran and the Sunnah forced the Asharis to realign themselves completely. Forced the Asharis to have to dig deep into their books and know what they're talking about and be able to teach their people, because they stopped teaching their people. The thing that was missing here was what we saw, and is still missing today, and very much needed. What's missing, in effect, is that the traditional camp failed to continue the efforts of earlier scholars like Mustafa Sabri and others. The traditional camp failed to be able to address the non-Muslim philosophers and the doubts. They became obsessed with just focusing on the narrow Salafis. But the Salafi effect was that when we began to, I saw the difference myself. When we began to study fiqh, everybody now, whether it was the lowest levels of fiqh or the intermediate, everybody's asking, what's the dalil? I remember when Sheikh Muqbil bin Hadi, rahmatullahi alayh, was calling for this whole issue of follow the dalil, follow the dalil. We already mentioned that the Ghumari camp, that has nothing to do directly with the Salafi dawah, was already calling to the dalil. This was the same thing with Shawkani, that has nothing to do with Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab directly. They were calling to the dalil. Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi prior to was calling to the dalil. But not everybody was calling to the dalil properly. That was the error in the Salafi dawah. That the translators, especially here in the US and so on and so forth, in reality, they were translating things that were being said by Sheikh Muqbil and others out of context. So they were talking about Quran and Sunnah with no preparation. Sheikh Muqbil was talking about calling to the dalil or calling to the evidence, but he had a whole organizational system. He had the match. So he had a whole layout of people studying. So he's talking to Arabic speakers. That was chaos, right? That was chaos when that idea came to us. because people are starting with no foundation. They're trying to understand. But the Salafi effect now has caused that all of the madhabs have reorganized themselves. There's no madhab right now that's not writing without clarifying what its evidences are. The Ash'ari and the Maturidi school, more so I would say the Ash'ari school, has realigned itself. The Maturidi school began to see a revival as well. The Salafi da'wah, in the narrow sense, has toned itself down greatly. And you find that in Saudi and other places, there's much more openness to kind of the position where Sadiq Hassan al-Khan was at earlier on. There's a little more openness to rational thought or philosophy and tasawwuf, and the hardliners have become somewhat marginalized. The Salafi effect, after 100 years, has forced a rethinking of a lot of issues. And the Salafi effect, get it out of your mind. You're erroneous in your thinking if you think that the Salafi effect is the brothers in the masjid that you encountered that gave you a hard time, that were part of your group, whatever it may be in that regard. That's not the Salafi effect. The Salafi effect was a movement overall that was initiated by Sufis, by Asharis, by Atharis. I have the data, the proof, the receipts. You saw it with Shawkani. You saw it with Sheikh Uthman Denfodio. You saw it with Muhammad Abdul. There's a wide range of people that were calling to, let's reform our educational systems. And it wasn't only a call to the Quran and the Sunnah. It was a call to reform even the way that Sufism was understood. It was a call to return back to centralizing the Arabic language. It was a call for the Muslims to think about sovereignty. It was a multi-layered call. Multi-layered call. And that's the reality of the situation. Shah Wali Allah, rahmatullahi alayhi, when he went on Hajj, he was the one that is popularly credited with bringing Isnad and Hadith to the subcontinent. Although there were others before him, Dr. Ibrahim Musa, the one who wrote the book on the poetics of Ghazali, he talks about the history prior to Shah Wali Allah and how there were others that were engaging in Hadith revival. But Shah Wali Allah became credited. You understand what I'm saying? And Shah Wali Allah was not a follower of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. That's what reinitiated the whole study of Hadith, because in the subcontinent, in many ways, in a symbolic sense, because the subcontinent was only focusing on rational sciences and so on and so forth. For a long time, the madrasa system was just focused on that. That was the same issue in Al-Azhar al-Sharif. Although Al-Azhar had Hafid ibn Hajar and others, and Al-Azhar has great scholars in Hadith, it became not known as a center of Hadith at all. After Salahuddin al-Ayyubi had reformed Al-Azhar, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi's time period, they had shut down Al-Azhar because the origins of Al-Azhar was with the Fatimid dynasty. And the Fatimid dynasty was an extremist Shia group, similar to what we were understanding in our times to be kind of like the Masonic movement. In any event, the unfortunate lessons that we gain from not engaging in reform and revival, the unfortunate lessons that we gain, some of these lessons, we haven't imbibed them, we haven't reflected upon them, we haven't thought about them. Every time there's a decline, and the reason why I mention this is because we're about at 100-year range. Okay, we're about at 100-year range. Every time there's a decline, the Ummah engages in Islah and Tajdeed, whether we like it or not. And you see it historically, it flows like that. And we have a hadith about the issue of the mujaddid, whether an individual or a group, emerging every 100 years. And the idea of tajdeed, it can emerge in different forms, not just one route. It can emerge in different forms. Because we fail to have a comprehensive outlook, and a comprehensive outlook means an interdisciplinary approach. And because we fail to engage the mind, the khilafah, what I call the khilafah mind. And the khilafah mind, what it means is that thinking like the khalifa versus talking about the figure of the khalif. And if you think about the khalifa, what are all the responsibilities that are there? And then you begin to see that there's more than just individual responsibilities. There's collective responsibilities. There's collective obligations. There's furud al-kifayat. And so most of us have been focused on furud al-ayan, or fard al-ayn, or the individual obligation. And even with that, we fail. Because in order to uphold the individual obligation, there are some collective obligations that have to be upheld. I'll give you an example. In order to establish salah at the foundational level, we need a masjid. The masjid is it an individual obligation? The adhan, is it an individual obligation or collective obligation? For the advanced student of knowledge or the intermediate student of knowledge, they know the ruling to that. They know. And then, okay, when does it become an individual obligation? When does it fall on all of us? If we really knew what we were talking about, that's the type of language that we will be dealing with in terms of da'wah and our priorities and what needs to be done. But failure to take the lessons, that is impossible for the revival of the ummah with just focusing on one thing. Right? We're just focusing on one thing. We have to have assigned people to different things. We have to have somebody focusing on certain things. But when we all focus on one thing, outside of the basic obligations, we all have to focus on the basic obligations. You understand what I'm saying? We all fall short on that. Some of us are more advanced or in a better situation than others. But the reality of the situation outside of the fard al-ayn or the basic obligations, we have the collective obligations. So when we don't understand the collective obligations, we don't understand deen in its entirety. When we don't understand the hadith of Jibreel properly, we only focus on the specifics of Aqida. And Jibreel came to bring us deen, teach us deen. Deen is much more than just specifics in Aqida. As a matter of fact, the specifics in Aqida, the ruling for that is that all of us are not obligated to know all of that. So the Salafi effect, it has brought about a lot of good as well as damage in some sides. But now what we need to do is we need to pull back and recognize where were the mistakes that everybody was making. Every group, because there's not one group that's going to have the claim of being in Firqat al-Najiyah. That's impossible. That one group is going to claim Firqat al-Najiyah. You start to see, if you start to outline, there's some serious issues with the claim of these movements and these groups to claim that. In any event, it's been about 100 years, so we see decline. All the movements are declining. So what do we learn from the past? What we learn from the past is that it's important to have an understanding of civilization. It's important to have an understanding of being familiar with the sources of Islam. It's important to separate between revelation and the ijtihadat of the ulama. Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi does that. It's important to have an understanding of how the knowledge applies to the people. It's important to have an understanding of what's essential, what are priorities, and what's detailed, and what's important to know only for certain groups of people. It's important to have a sense of ummah. It's important to have to make the gains and to look at all of what has been happening over the last 100 years and study it with the understanding of what were the gains that we made. But that oppositional force that was coming to the status quo from the Salafi effect, that, by the way, Sufis and Atharis and others engaged in, and Kalamists engaged in, all of them, we can find groups that were calling to return back to the Quran and the Sunnah. Some did more of a better job when it comes to reviving the Aqida of Ahl al-Hadith than others. Some did a better job when it came to utilizing Kalam for its original purpose, which is to address the doubts caused by the non-Muslims and others, like Mustafa Sabri, versus Al-Kawthari, that engaged in a full-blown attack on the Muslims. That's my opinion. I don't care if people agree with it or not. While Sheikh Mustafa Sabri was debating Newton and these types of people and trying to remove the doubt that was being brought to science, which eventually led to places like Turkey becoming kafir, you know, in the general sense. Turkey literally imposed upon the people straight kufr. That doesn't mean that every Turk became a kafir, but the overall system became openly opposed to the deen. Al-Kawthari decided to start attacking the Muslims themselves. And that's part of the dilemma that we have with both narrow Salafis and narrow Asharis in their approaches. Instead of dialoguing with each other and knowing that at a certain point we're going to have to bring it to the end, they make war on each other and they leave the tasks that need to be dealt with, they leave them to the side. They leave them to the side. So the 100-year effect of the Salafi da'wah, in the general sense, not in the sense of just Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab, has been the revival of Hadith studies, has been the critical assessment of Sufism. We find that even Maulana Thanawi, as much as people may disagree with him, Maulana Thanawi has many writings in which he wrote about the problems that exist in Sufism and the necessity of reforming it from bid'ah and so on and so forth. But at the same time, you know, we saw Salafi da'wah in the narrow sense. Now it's coming to realize that you just can't talk about Aqidah in terms of just Tawheed al-Ibadah in the most narrowest sense, like, you know, like not worshiping a grave or not asking from the dead, that type of thing, and then ignore the heart. Ignore the heart. Ignore amal al-qulub. Ignore the actions of the heart. That was the excesses of the narrow Salafi da'wah. But we're in ni'mah now, as far as I'm concerned. We're under the blessings of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and we're coming upon a new age. The new age that we're coming into is the revival of the Muslim mind, and we're coming into reaping the benefits of the 100-year struggle if we apply ourselves to really understand. The other struggle that we have is with ourselves. We've been colonized in our desire and in our thinking. And so the necessity of reform of the self is just as high. But there's been so much work that has been done, alhamdulillah. So much work that has been done, not only in the last 100 years, but in the last 1300 years, to ensure that Muslims have an understanding of the deen, that what we have to do is apply ourselves to the whole study and to the practice and to the working of for the deen. If only we did that. If only we revived the idea of the necessity of self-reform and the idea of community building and the idea of education and understanding, and get outside of this civil war type of mindset, because that's what destroyed Al-Andalus, and it destroyed Al-Andalus to the point where Al-Andalus disappeared. The lack of really empowering the Muslims is what led to places like Uzbekistan and all that region, which gave birth to Bukhari, to Islam being wiped out, completely wiped out from the public sphere. No contribution back except individual practice, wiped out at the collective level. And we can see that that was the case with Albania and in Kosovo and those regions. They got hit extremely hard by the communist assault. We saw the materialism in Turkey, how it took an impact. Until right now, they're still struggling with that reality. We see the reality in Tunis, the same thing. All of these signs of decline that we have seen. We've also seen some revival efforts But those revival efforts are not going to be by one movement. That's what we learned with the Salafi Effect after the 100 years, that when we talk about the reality of the hadith of Tajdeed or the Mujaddid, that the Mujaddid in reality is going to come by a collective effort. And that collective effort, we need to understand how it has blossomed over the last 100 years or so. And so we're in a position to really critically assess everything, not because we're critically assessing with our own intellects and our feelings and our desires and our perspective, but because there's been so much work that has gone into this, that we're able to see properly where were our excesses and where we need to move forward. And there's a lot of efforts in that regard, if only we took the lesson. لو كنا نشتغل بالعبر. And if we were to occupy ourselves with the lessons, we would be able to see how great the ni'mah of Allah is to us in terms of understanding the deen. The question now is, what happens after this 100 years? 100 years of the fall of the Khilafah, 100 years of efforts and discussions and debates about reviving the deen. Where are we going at now? And what does it mean after this 100 years that you have so many Muslims in the West? What does it mean? You understand what I'm saying? I can't answer those questions by myself. There's no way. You understand what I'm saying? That has to be, I can give an individual answer, but when I'm not looking for making individual statements. We as a community have to come to a conclusion on that regard. You know, in that regard, like, where do we go? Even the last 20 years, just by itself, 20 years, give yourself 20, 25-year analysis of where the Muslims have been in the U.S. Where do we go in the next coming 25 years? That's a question that we have to ask. There's been fallbacks, setbacks, and there's been advances that we have made. But in reality, we have to critically assess, especially our condition. But there's a reason why in the past, the ulama prohibited the Muslims to go to non-Muslim lands. And part of that was, there was an understanding that da'wah had to be done. But part of that is that the absence of the collective leads to the decline of the individual. When there's no collective effort, the individual will collapse and possibly lose iman. That's something that's very important to focus on. And I'm not saying we have to make hijrah, but we definitely have to make, in the physical sense, but we have to make hijrah from the mentality that we have. We have to migrate from the individualistic mentality that we have and the lack of really benefiting from the tools that Allah has given us. Right? And what happens to a people when they're oppressed, they become hard on each other. أقول قولي هذا استغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين ونستغفر الله.